The most important things when my kids have told me the most important moments for them have been when I have come into their world. So I've come into their room and laid on their floor next to their dirty socks and said, how are you? What's going on? Tell me what's going on for you today. And I want to be a part of what's going on in their world. I come in without an agenda, a prescribed agenda, but really just understanding who they are in that moment, what they need from me, how they feel about being in the world on that particular day. And I do that with my kids. I did it on a daily basis. I would check in with them at certain points in time, not only when I was angry with them or they didn't do a chore or they were in trouble, but really in a very neutral, very calm and neutral time. I would just want to be in their world and make an effort to see them in a very organic way. This is Dr. Lisa Bravo, and this is the Tom Rowland Podcast.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the podcast today. We're going to go and do something a little different today, but I have a feeling that a big portion of you guys are going to like it, and it has to do with parenting. We have talked a lot about parenting. We've talked a lot about getting kids into the outdoors, the importance of getting kids into the outdoors, the importance of trying to get them off their devices, maybe the importance of just connection, family connection, whether that's between you and your wife, you and your kids. And we always try to kind of gravitate to the kids because on Saltwater Experience, I don't know if you've noticed, you probably have, but there's an underlying theme of getting kids into the outdoors, getting our own kids into the outdoors, raising them with this fishing, outdoor, adventure type lifestyle that all is about family. And Dr. Lisa Bravo has written a book called The Bravo Effect. And she has some really good information, suggestions based upon her work as a family therapist and how she has helped parents to deal with extreme situations. And my experience is that if you can deal with extreme situations, you can deal with regular situations pretty well. And so I wanted to get her on the show and just kind of talk about the state of our kids right now and our relationships and coming off of COVID and all these changes that are in the world and how that relates to our relationship with our children, what social media, what the internet, what video games, what they are doing to our children, both good and bad, and how we can, not place taboos on certain things, but how we can learn to navigate as parents in this world that includes video games and social media and the internet and lots of distractions and lots of things that make kids really not necessarily want to go outside, and how we can make sure that we're doing the best job of parenting that we possibly can to grow healthy children in both mind, body, and spirit, and also, just to have a healthy relationship with our kids. So that's what we're going to talk about today with Dr. Lisa Bravo. She's coming up next. If you like this podcast, please share it with others that you know that may like it too. Some of your buddies that have kids, that you fish or hunt with. Some of your social media followers. That would be awesome. Put it on your social media. This one is a powerful episode, and I think that I know that I got a lot out of it. I hope that you will as well. But if you like it, share it. And if you have any questions or you want to talk about the episode, you can text 305-930-7346. That is the number where you can reach me all the time. It's the text for the show. So you can send your show suggestions, your guest suggestions, your comments, your questions, whatever. You can send to that number, and I'll be glad to hear from you. So that's the way to get in touch with me. If you like this show, please rate and review it. It's easy for me to say, rate and review it on iTunes. That goes a long way to getting us more listeners and ranking higher so more people can find the show. And that's awesome because we want the show to be super popular so that we can continue to do it and get better and better guests every time so we can bring you better and better shows. So you can help us, we'll help you. And that is the way the world goes round. So Dr. Lisa Bravo is coming up. I really hope you like this show. Let me know if you do. And all the best to all of you in your parenting endeavors. As a parent of 3, I know it can be challenging even on the best days. It can also be it is the most rewarding part of my life. And something that was when I wasn't a parent, I had no idea even existed. Now, as a parent of 3, man, I listen to anything I can to help me be better at it. And this podcast may just be one of those things. So anyway, Dr. Lisa Bravo coming up right now.
Hey, I'm Tom Rowland.
And I'm Rich Tudor of Saltwater Experience.
Scan the QR code below or go to tackledirect.tv to enter to win a chance to go fishing at the beautiful Hawks Cay Resort in the Florida Keys with Saltwater Experience.
And if you're not lucky enough to win the grand prize, there's other prize packages from some of our major sponsors, Lowrance, Hook, St. Croix, Daiwa, Yeti, and many more, giving away great prize packages, so check it out.
You're not going to want to miss this, so scan that code below or go to tackledirect.tv because that's the only way you can enter.
Dr. Lisa Bravo, how are you? Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you got a lot of interesting things going on. You got the new book. You've got a whole career of helping people. How's the book going?
It's actually going great. We launched it in April, and it hit #1 bestseller on Amazon in the first week. And it's been really well received. I think it's a really important topic, especially post-pandemic and with everything going on with teenagers today.
Right. Well, I have some of my own. I'm through some of the teen years. I still have some behind me. I have a 23-year-old, a 21-year-old, and a 17-year-old. So I know just enough about parenting to be dangerous, I think. I've learned a little bit more from each child. I tell my poor oldest son, he's like, well, you never let me do those things that you're letting the other ones do. And I was like, man, honestly, we had no idea what we were doing.
The first one out of the barrel has it the hardest.
I know, but I try to be really honest with him. I'm like, listen, man, we really didn't know what we were doing. We had no idea. We were literally hacking our way through the jungle with a machete with you. With your brother, we knew a little bit more. And with your sister, we know a little bit more. If we were to have another one, we would know a little bit more. But literally every day of his life as the oldest child was a new frontier. Like we had never seen that. We had never experienced that. And here we are right now getting ready for my daughter to go to college next year. And the empty nest syndrome is real. That we're dealing with that here at my house, preparing for that. Yes. And that's I don't know. It's you. How many children do you have?
I have 2 children. One is 25 and one is 23. So they're kind of past that, that kind of squirrely teenager stage. But they're also, I think I've found in my practice, at least over the last several years, that teenagers tend to, that adolescent stage has shifted to a little bit later. So I think, you hear that expression that 40 is the new 50 and 30 is the new 20. I really think that kids, young adults, a lot of them really do present a lot like older teenagers used to 20 years ago.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I'm seeing a lot more emotional immaturity and not quite as much, developmentally. I'm seeing lots of delays in their social and interpersonal skills. And I think a lot of that has to do with the internet. Mm-hmm. They don't have to kind of steep themselves in deep conversations anymore. Everything's very superficial. It's very immediate gratification on the internet. if you don't like this person, you just swipe and get rid of them and you move on to the next friend group. So I'm not seeing a lot of like people having to kind of use the grit and resiliency it takes to be in really intimate relationships. And I think that's affecting our teenagers in negative ways.
That's interesting that you bring grit into intimate relationships. Like, I don't know if I ever thought about it like that. I've certainly read Angela Duckworth's book Grit and Mindset by Carol Dweck, and those are two of my favorite books. But I don't know that I really thought about grit in that way. Like I immediately gravitate to athletics and like hard work and things like that. But there is a tremendous amount of grit in a relationship. I mean, it's maybe even more so than anywhere else. Like, it's really easy to give up. It's really easy just to not go down that road, but I never thought about it like that. You're saying that you're not seeing grit from the young people like that in the interpersonal relationships specifically.
And I think it's very difficult for them to kind of dig deeper too, because their peers are also in the same sort of genre where they can swipe left too when it gets too hard, and they can delete people and they can move on. So, I think it's very hard for them to be vulnerable, first of all. And then when they're also at the mercy of the other person. So it's such a precarious place that they are. I think also, they're exposed to so much from such an early age. We know now that teenagers are, their first experience with pornography is 10 years old.
Wow.
So if you think about that, they have this very unrealistic viewpoint, and they have access to things we never had access to as children. And they have to navigate and understand which part of it's reality and which part of it isn't real. And I think it's very hard for them to define those lines if they don't have a lot of grounding in their home life or among their peer group.
So how do you reinforce that grounding at home? Like, that's very interesting.
Yeah, that's a great question, Tom. I think, the American family has changed exponentially over the last several years. And I know that the pandemic brought a lot of hard times to a lot of people, but I also think there was a silver lining for some families in that for the first time in a long time, they had to sit together and figure out how to be together and have conflict that they had to work out together. And, there was nowhere to go. They had to, figure out how to be families again. For the first time, we saw all those videos of people making bread together and learning how to cook and all of those things that we sort of like took for granted, I think, as a culture, that we didn't have to do those things. That was just, something we didn't have time for it.
Yeah.
And when busyness was taken away, that layer of busyness, I think there were a lot of families that it was kind of do or die time for them. You either sunk or swim. And I'm seeing lots of that. I'm seeing families that have come out with a lot of resilience and a renewed sense of their family. And then I'm seeing families that are going through divorce now. So I think this last year has been really, really telling in terms of understanding where your family is from a mental health standpoint and a stress tolerance standpoint.
Yeah. One of the things that happened in our industry of the outdoors and fishing was that, just like you said, there is a silver lining. Just 2 years ago, we were thinking, how do you get young people to go fishing? Because fishing is like a passed down type thing. Like it's not a lot of kids are just deciding that they want to go fishing and just getting into it by themselves, or, on their own. Sometimes that happens, and that's great when it does. But a lot of times it's a grandfather or right, a parent exactly. that teaches someone, or a mentor, or uncle, or aunt, or a neighbor, or somebody's teaching something and passing it down. And then when the pandemic hit, we have had a record number of people going outside right now. There are a record number of new anglers, a record number of new hunters, a record number of new people getting out to kayak and hike and backpack and do things that weren't even on the radar a few years ago. In fact, it's hard to buy a boat right now, and it's hard to buy tents and backpacking supplies. And so I see that as something that's been really, really good that comes out of it. But I could also see how, I know a lot of people have had a really rough time. But one of the things that your book, I read the first chapter of your book, which was really interesting. I wish I had gotten to read the whole thing before the interview, but it'll be a learning process for me. It's interesting that your book right now, when it comes out, is kind of about what you're calling extreme teens, extreme situations, to where your parents are able to reconnect with kids that there's this disconnect going on. And maybe the pandemic was an opportunity, or maybe post-pandemic is a great opportunity. I think that it obviously is something that people need if your book skyrockets to the top of the list. But what do you think about like that idea of getting outside and reconnecting with your kids outdoors? Is that part of the plan?
Absolutely. I think, connection is a very organic thing. In my office, it's not organic. It's usually kids being drug in on the heels of some version of a crisis, and they're sort of kind of forced to kind of figure this thing out together. But I think when we can find really organic ways to connect with our teenagers, especially, it's really important. And I think parents of teenagers are often under the impression that our teenagers don't want to be around us. And I think that is a misconception. I think every teenager that I have met, every single one, has a desire to be seen and loved and understood. And so if we can figure out how to connect with them in a way that is really intimate and at the core of who they are so much better off moving forward. Being outdoors is a great way to accomplish that. And don't expect your teenagers to say, when you say we're going fishing and camping over the weekend, don't expect them to jump up and down and clap and be so excited. Expect them to be upset about it. Expect them to be resistant. Expect them to not want to go. Expect them to be upset because they can't bring their phone or the phone's not going to work. All of that is part of the process of getting away and unplugging. But our teenagers don't know how to unplug. We are very poor role models for teaching our children how to unplug. And so I think doing that is there is, we know in the brain, the way the brain works, that these devices, when they're online, it triggers the part of their brain that is the reward center of the brain. So they physiologically and biologically are going to have a shift in the chemicals in their brain that make them feel good. So they will feel actual clinical depression being pulled away from those devices. And you just need to know that's part of it. And think about it like detoxing from a drug. They're going to be crabby and difficult for a few days, and then they'll adjust. And then they're going to come out of their shell and start talking to you and tell you what's going on in their lives. And it's a great opportunity for parents and for kids, as long as your expectations are appropriate.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I've certainly seen and experienced exactly what you're talking about, and it's kind of like it's this big drag. And that's where I think that the parents' expectations, or maybe it's somebody else's expectations. Maybe it's the friend, maybe it's the uncle, maybe it's whoever is taking them on this excursion. But at the very beginning, where they're kicking and screaming and they don't want to go, it's pretty easy at that point to kind of be like, well, this is going to be the worst weekend of our life. And for the parent to adopt that, which, that's not really why you're going, right? Like, how does a parent navigate that when the kid is just not at all interested in being there, or seemingly maybe they just like you're saying, they just haven't reset the chemicals yet. And
right.
So how long, or how does a parent kind of navigate that?
Well, I think first is knowing, like, anticipating that's how it's going to be. I think when parents have this expectation that the kids are going to pack the car and thank you for bringing them and be so excited about getting up at 6 o'clock in the morning, that's when we as parents get really disappointed. And that's when we fall apart because our idea of what's going to happen does not match the reality of what's going to happen. So I think part of it is not being attached to the outcome of what it looks like, but understanding that it's going to be bumpy. You know, it's a new process for your child. They're not used to being alone with you. They're not used to having to, interact in this intimate way, and it makes them uncomfortable. It doesn't feel natural or normal to them. And so part of it is understanding that as the parent. It's sort of like if you have a toddler and you bring them to school for the first time, and then you're upset because they have a meltdown when you leave. I mean, most parents are prepared for this kid's going to have a meltdown. They're not going to be comfortable. And we know that's part of the process. So I think with when we bring our teenagers out into the wilderness for the first time, they're going to be uncomfortable. They're out of their element and they don't feel in control of anything. But I do know the best part of being outdoors, at least for especially my son, but both of my kids, was being able to light the fire.
Yeah.
That is the best part of camping, hands down. They still talk about, being around the fire pit and all the time we spent, building the fire and being around that version of danger. I think that was exciting for them.
Yeah, but there's something else that goes on there that we've lost touch with, and certainly happened much more when we lived in a more outdoor culture. I mean, fire was a part of life, and like even
Right.
when I was a guide out in Wyoming and Idaho, we would do a tremendous number of overnights, and the first thing that you would do is start the fire, and then everybody would end up sitting around the fire. You're staring into this fire, and if you're not staring into this fire, you're having a conversation with everyone around you, and if you're not doing that, you're staring at the stars.
Right.
And those are three things that are really missing from a lot of people's lives now. Sitting around a campfire, which
Right.
I kind of think of this podcast as sitting around a campfire. And that was the idea. We used to have the greatest conversations sitting around these campfires, just talking. And you would end up talking about things that you never thought you would end up talking about, with these people that you just met that day. And you've had this great day with them, but you're sitting around this campfire. And it can be the same with your children, I think, of there's something about that fire, though. It's almost like a meditative state, or
that's what it's like, a moving meditation with your family. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it is interesting to see kids that are uncomfortable with the outdoors, and then you see this kind of transformation to it. But then you can also see these kids where you take them outdoors and they get away from their phone and whatever chemical resets. And it is so now they're dirty. They are rolling in the mud. They are playing in the stream. They are having the greatest time ever. And they didn't even know that was missing from their life.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. It's really interesting.
It removes a veil, and it also teaches them competence. It teaches them that they can get through things. It teaches, when a kid can start a fire. I work with so many kids that come out of wilderness therapy. Why do you think that is such a successful? They have some of the highest successful rates with teenagers is wilderness therapy, because they get out and they learn to depend on themselves and rely on themselves in a way they've never had to before. And they learn a sense of competency that they didn't ever have before, and success and self-control and all of those things that we try to instill in them, but we just scratch the surface with them in terms of what they need on a pretty generally speaking, but I think it's a pretty consistent problem that we see.
It's interesting that they have such a high success rate with wilderness therapy, and I'm thinking it's probably like an Outward Bound or some type of program like that, where you're taking the kids out and making them fend for themselves. But when you compare that to the helicopter parenting and just coddling your kids and being just trying everything you can not to to smooth the road out for them so they never have a skin knee, and then what really works, though, is exactly the opposite, which is what you're saying, is that this wilderness therapy and letting them go out there and fend for themselves is where they start to really thrive. what kind of lesson can you take that back to parents that, don't have a kid that necessarily needs wilderness therapy? They're not that well. I think every kid needs wilderness therapy personally, that from my perspective, but but when a kid hasn't had this big crisis, they're a pretty good kid. Everything's going pretty well for them. But where's the lesson where you see that kids thrive outdoors, when they're having to fend for themselves, and how do you apply that to regular parenting?
Well, I think part of it is, like you were saying, I think there's so many parents that are so afraid to let their kids struggle, and they're so afraid to let their kids, suffer or go without or feel like they can't or fail. We don't allow our children to have any failures. I have so many parents that, they expect that their kids get A's, period. C is an average. C is the middle, right? But if every child gets an A, that's impossible statistically that every child is going to get straight A's. But we have these expectations of our children that are unreasonable. And then our kids try to meet those expectations. And when the bar is set too high, they just don't even try to jump over it anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that teaching kids how to be uncomfortable in healthy ways, how to fail and fail forward in healthy ways, teaches them resiliency, and teaches them it gives them the ability to know that they can start over and they can move forward even when they hit a speed bump. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of parents they're so afraid, because I think they also get inundated with all this information and all these scary statistics about teen suicide and depression and anxiety, and they don't want their kid to become a statistic. So it comes from a really, really good place in their hearts, that it comes from good intentions. But what happens is when we overparent and when we hover in the ways that we've learned to do as parents, our children don't learn how to fail forward, and they don't learn how to start over. And that's detrimental to them in the long run. And when it gets really scary, Tom, is when they go away to college, right? You have college age kids. When kids flounder and they're not under our roofs anymore, and they have a driver's license and a credit card, and they have the influence of all these people we don't even know, that's when it gets really scary. I always tell parents, when their kids are struggling in the younger adolescent years, 14 to 18, that is the best time for them to struggle,
right?
Because they have parents and they have guidance and they have the ability to oversee. The parents have the ability to oversee what's going on with their kids, and they can connect with them and teach them lessons along the way.
Yeah, it's like a safe place to fail. Like, right. Like, I don't know. I mean, that's what's the way an athletic field is it's a safe place. You lose a game. Okay. So you lost a game. So you're the one that dropped the ball and lost the game. Okay. Well, is there a lesson there? But you don't even want to see, your child do that. But that is the best place for them to do that. What you're talking about with the A students and all of the expectations and stuff, that was a huge takeaway that I took from Mindset, the book, Carol Dweck, it being that C students failed all the time. D students, they failed all the time. So risk was not, every day was a risk. Like, yeah, I don't know how to do this, so I'm going to try to do it, and failed again. Where the A student, the super A student that was told their whole life how smart they are and how good they are and how they're going to go to, Yale or Harvard or whatever, and they're going to be a doctor, whatever they want to do. They were so afraid to take any risk because it might expose them as something that they were told that they weren't what they were told. Like, everybody has told them that they were so smart. And the takeaway there for the parenting, for my own parenting, was, reward the kid for hard work, not, don't tell them how smart they are. Like, right. That made a big difference in my own kids.
There are a lot of smart kids that don't know how to be successful.
Right. C students run the world sometimes, or a lot of the world, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny though how that happens, because that's not what they tell you is going to happen in high school.
Right.
If you get a C on this test, that's going to have, horrible effects on the rest of your life, where actually it has almost zero effect on the rest of your life. But it's real interesting, and I think that you're definitely touching on a topic that a lot of people are wrestling with. So I'm curious, like your practice and how you kind of evolved this, what you're calling the Bravo effect. Like, can you tell us what the Bravo effect is, and what your philosophy on all of this is, and what kind of where your book is?
Sure. Well, just to give you a little bit of a thumbnail, I am a family therapist. So my background is working with families primarily, but I, specialize in working with teenagers. And the Bravo effect was written just in response to I really wanted to provide parents with a very simple framework for applying how to evaluate where your relationship is with your child at any given time. And so Bravo stands for behavior, relationships, attitudes, values, and opportunities. And so when you're looking, the first thing that gets our attention as parents is always behavior, right? We see certain behavior that makes us angry or frustrates us or scares us, and that's what gets our attention. But if we just discipline the behavior, or we just react or respond to the behavior, we're really not getting beneath it to understand what's going on. So what's beneath that behavior is, where am I in relationship with my child right now? Are we connected? Are we disconnected? Is there tension? Is there conflict? What is the nature of our relationship right now? What is my child's attitude about what's going on right now? What is my attitude about my child? What is our attitude together? What are we co-creating? So understanding that dynamic of what attitude or what position we're taking in that moment is really important. Lots of times teenagers can take what we think is a disrespectful attitude, but if we really understand what's going on beneath the surface, maybe they're just being really passionate about what they believe in. Maybe they're just really, really want the outcome to be something that it isn't, and they're having a hard time expressing that. Lots of times when kids are in conflict, a lot of it has to do with poor communication. So a lot of what we do within the relationship, what I talk to parents about is really like, how is the communication? Is it part of it has to do with the parenting style. Part of it has to do with connection, but what type of communication are you having with your child? When we have kids who are acting out, we tend to try and pull rank on them and become the authoritarian. And that's not always the best way to handle things. Sometimes it's better just to, like we were talking about earlier, just go outside and go for a walk. And we do know, especially with boys, there's actual brain studies that show that when boys are face to face with you, and teenage boys, that their testosterone levels spike because they're looking for conflict. But when you're walking next to a teenager who's in conflict, they're not as triggered. And so how you position yourself, especially fathers with their children and their teenage boys, if you position yourself walking next to them, driving in the car, those are the best times to have conversations with your teenager, not when you're face to face and toe to toe and both of you have your fists clenched because you're angry. That is not when your children are the most receptive. So trying to find those times where communication is the most optimal is the best way to handle it in terms of connection. So then after we understand kind of what attitude or position our child is holding in that moment, we try to understand what they're valuing, what I'm valuing in that moment. Maybe I want them to be respectful and they're being disrespectful, right? Or I see their behavior as disrespectful. Maybe they're valuing, loyalty to a friend because they're not giving up. They're not telling you what they did with, they're not giving you names of people. Maybe we can look at all angles of it and understand what's really motivating their decision in that moment. And then we can find opportunity. The last letter is O for opportunity. There is an opportunity in every moment, even the most dire moments, there's an opportunity. And if we can find that opportunity and really expound on it, we can find a way to connect through that opportunity. It makes all the difference in the world in how the relationship moves from that point.
And so, like, what would an opportunity look like? Like you say, there's an opportunity in everything. So you have, you've got emotions are raging and you're just, the kid says, well, I'm leaving home. And you say, well, okay. Where's the opportunity? Like what you say that there's an opportunity in everything. And so people, obviously say the wrong thing with emotions and do the wrong thing, stand up and walk out of the room. I don't know. But how do you notice that opportunity? How do you even identify it?
Yeah. And I think what happens when we're in the throes of it, it's very hard to see. So as parents, we need to learn how to kind of unplug ourselves from that moment and try to take a bird's eye view and go, okay, what's going on here that I can look at as a pivot point? And with teenagers, just that example that you gave, everyone's screaming and yelling and the kid's like, I'm out of here. And, we're like, go ahead. And, in that moment, the opportunity that I see is that child still standing there fighting for their position.
Right.
So that is a kid who still wants to have a conversation, who still wants to have a relationship, who still is in the game.
Interesting.
And if we can look at that instead of the words, because the words are just the behavior, they're just meant to push us away. If we can dig beneath those words and understand, wow, you must really feel hurt and rejected by what I just said. That must have really hurt your feelings. I said it out of anger and I shouldn't have said it. Taking responsibility for, we want our children to be respectful, but we don't always convey respect to them. We just expect that they're going to be respectful. But if we take a moment and say, you know what, here's where I went wrong. Here's what I want to take responsibility for. What we're doing is we're not submitting to them. We're modeling for them what it looks like when we take responsibility for behavior. And it teaches them that parents aren't perfect and neither are kids. It provides this kind of lights up the runway for us to have other opportunities to connect. The moment I take a step back and say, you know what, this is where I was wrong. And I'm hoping that you can forgive me.
Well, what a good role model. What a good role model you're being right there to show that there's some accountability left in this world, that you are willing to take responsibility for your actions, and so should they. Because that's not the lesson that is coming through all the time today.
Right.
Yeah. That's cool. The opportunity, because you're exactly right. I mean, what do you think? I mean, when you were saying kind of that, and the fact that you have children of your own, and you've been a family counselor for a while, you are kind of looking at this, especially now that your kids are grown. You're saying you're stepping back, or parents could step back and take kind of a bird's eye view. But a lot of times, like when we were talking about before the podcast of it's your first child, you don't know anything, and everything is new. So this first conversation, this first act of defiance, this first whatever, acting out, it's brand new. By the third kid, you've seen this 100 times, right? But the first one, you don't know what in the world to do. And it almost feels like, I don't know, you're so in it, and you're looking right at a tree instead of looking even at 10 trees or the whole forest. You seem to be looking way more, have a much different perspective because of all the work that you've done and your own parenting. What do you think, what would you say success is as a parent?
Oh, that's a great question. I think every parent may define it differently, but I also believe that it is our responsibility as parents to raise emotionally competent, mentally stable, and well human beings to kind of create the next generation of people and to parent the next generation of people. So I think that if my focus is on, creating emotional competency and emotional intelligence and really cultivating that in my kids, I've done my job. So from where I sit, and, maybe I'm biased, but I believe that is probably the most important and most lacking part of what we're teaching our children, generally speaking, in our culture right now.
So
I do think though recently there has been a lot of recent information being put out in the media about mental health and wellness and stress management with teenagers, and I think it's a really important and timely. We have a huge crisis in our country. The suicide rates have skyrocketed. Anxiety and depression has skyrocketed, and it's all of it is connected to how our children feel as they move through the world and how they feel connected to the people in their lives.
Really? And as we began the podcast saying that there's a significant lack of connection because of the internet. And I see it all the time. I mean, one of the things we were talking about the other day on the podcast was one thing that's missing from kids is boredom right now, and boredom in the sense that when I grew up, there were 3 channels on television. Mm-hmm. My parents didn't tell me when I could watch TV or when I couldn't watch TV. I could watch TV anytime I wanted to, but the fact of the matter was, I didn't want to watch soap operas in the middle of the day. It was, or maybe you could tolerate some game show like Wheel of Fortune or something like that for like 15 minutes. But sooner or later, there was nothing to do. And you had to go outside and go find some friends, get on your bike, ride around. I don't know, maybe even hang out with your dog in the yard for a while. And the next thing you know, some other kid comes by, you're inventing some sort of game because you're just sitting there with a lot of time on your hands and literally nothing to do. For me, that was like a creative, that helped my creative mind develop. And I just wonder, like, that is not happening that much. It was actually with the quarantine, you did start to see that much more. Like you can play with the kids right around here, like 2 houses away or whatever. And you could see, I don't know, it was like a baseball game or a kickball game. Or I saw it starting to happen again, that kids couldn't just do whatever they wanted to. And so they were going outside and they were playing with their brothers or sisters, or they were doing things like that. But it's just an interesting time with the internet and what seems like you're connected to everyone in the world when in fact you're really not connected to anyone.
Right. It's all superficial. Yeah. I think it's I talk in the book, there's quite a bit about boredom being sort of a risk factor for suicide. Unfortunately, in the last several years, I've noticed this trend where, I used to, during breaks, summer breaks, spring break, and we have a winter break out here in Arizona, that used to be a time where my practice would really slow down and I wouldn't have a lot of work. But in recent years, that it's been the opposite. There's a lot more kids that don't know how to handle boredom. So they engage in destructive behavior. They become suicidal. They have really self-harming behaviors increase during those times because they have the boredom kind of instills this anxiety that they don't know what to do with. And when they don't have school as a distraction, it's very difficult for kids. And I think that's why this year in the pandemic, we've seen the suicide attempt rates and depression and anxiety rates skyrocket with teenagers because they have had to deal with some version of boredom. And a lot of them have a very difficult time with that.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, Now, it's really not the boredom that's the problem. It's how to deal with the boredom. Like,
Yes.
we were bored every day. Like,
Right.
that's just the thing. I mean, there wasn't anything to do. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have video games. We had terrible TV shows on TV. So you were just bored. So you went to the creek.
Most of us had to watch TV as a family too.
Right.
You know,
there was one TV.
The isolation that kids have. They have it. Every kid has a TV in their room. They never have to leave there. And it creates so much isolation for kids where we think that we're giving them some sort of like a reward for being able to have their own TV. But really what it does is it isolates them and it separates them even more.
So what do you think? I mean, what kind of advice do you give people about the use of devices and the freedom that you give the, kids of certain ages to just hibernate in their room and watch movies or watch YouTube or whatever? What kind of advice do you give normally? Well,
it's definitely easier if you start early and you use the internet as a tool rather than and a privilege rather than a right. I think a lot of kids think they have a right to their phone and a right to their privacy and a right to their devices. And when we are not a good steward of that device and we expect them to self-regulate when they're 10 and 12 years old, most kids get a phone when they're between 10 and 12 years old. You think about what you're doing to them is you're giving them this device that gives them access to the entire world. And then you're saying, good luck.
Right.
And we're hoping they handle it well. And then we're frustrated and upset when they don't. I think that it's really important to understand when you're handing that device over, what you're actually giving to your child and what, and not having any parental controls or parameters in place is really, really dangerous. I think with teenagers, once that ship has sailed and they're used to having everything be theirs, I think it's a lot harder to pull it back then. But I think for a lot of kids, it's really necessary because they do have a hard time self-regulating and self-managing. Just about every app that's been developed, all those gaming apps were developed by people who specialize in addiction.
Yeah.
They were developed by people who build slot machines. So I'm telling you, they were built for addiction. So we are basically, as the brain is developing and growing, we are basically making addiction part of that brain's architecture. And it's so important to understand that. It's, taking it away completely is not reasonable. Devices are here to stay. But I think having a healthy relationship with those devices is so important. And that means that we have to be unpopular as parents sometimes. That means we have to say no, even if our friends' parents let them do such and such. It doesn't mean that that's what you need to do for your child. The other thing is, as parents, I think it's super important that we model healthy behavior with our devices. So many parents are on their devices all the time, but they want their kids to get off.
Right.
And
there's a weird little thing there because a lot of parents make their living on their phone, especially today after the pandemic. Like, they are capable of working anywhere. They're capable of working anytime. It lends itself to more time with the family, but they're on the phone all the time. And yes, they're making a living, and yes, they're providing for their family, but the kid doesn't see it that way. The kid doesn't see that that's any different trading stocks or answering emails. That's any different than scrolling Instagram. That's what the kid sees. And I'm bad like that because, the internet is really important to my business and I need to be checking on some things. And there's a lot of times there are people waiting, like in the edit or something, for me to watch something and say, okay, well, this is not what we need. We need to go this direction, or this is good. Keep going. And I'm holding up a whole bunch of people waiting for this answer. But it happens to be dinner time. And I'm telling the kids that they can't have phones, but why can I have a phone? And I know that I've been hypocritical and bad about that. What's the advice there? Like, when that's your business, and how do you model that behavior for your children?
Well, I think that's a great question because I think a lot of us work from home and a lot of us are on call and all of those kinds of things. It's hard to turn it off. But I think it's super important that we send the message that if dinner time is what you expect your child to show up and participate and have joy in their heart and be engaged, then you don't get to get your phone out at dinner.
Right.
That's just all there is to it.
I mean, but how do you ever expect your child to do something if you like, don't do what I do what I say? Like that's not a good approach. I don't know. Or maybe it's a good approach for some people, but it doesn't seem to work for a lot of people.
Right. And I think our kids are always watching us, and we are sort of their sounding board for how the world works. So if we're telling them one thing and we're doing another, it degrades their trust in us. Mm-hmm. It gets them to a point where they don't they don't always believe they can trust what we have to say if we're not being congruent.
Wow. And that's a really hard one. That is a really hard one because it
really is hard being grown up, isn't it?
It is. It's hard being a grown up, and then it's really hard being a parent because all of these things are, I mean, it's just such a new world and it's just changing so very fast with technology and stuff. An interesting thing before we move on to another subject, with my oldest son, he's 23. So this was 17, 18 years ago. And video games were probably not as advanced as they are today. Yes, they were probably being built by the same people that build slot machines, and the colors and everything were designed for, getting a kid to play longer. I think today it's a whole different universe of that going on. But he wanted to play video games all the time. Like that's just what he wanted. And for whatever reason, we just thought, no, video games are not good. So this is where we're going to draw the line in the sand. We're not going to have video games until you get to a certain age or whatever. Well, meanwhile, his friends all had video games. So the only thing he wanted to do when he went to his friend's house was play video games. And because it was kind of taboo, he was drawn to it and he wanted to play so bad. Now, meanwhile, his little brother, finally we gave in. We say, okay, we'll get the gaming system because I see what's going on here. You're going over to your friend's house and now you're totally withdrawn over there. All you're doing is playing their video games. They don't even want you to come over anymore because you're not doing what you were planning on doing. They're going swimming and you're inside playing video games. That's not good. So we saw that and we were like, okay, we need to somehow moderate this and allow it to an extent. And then finally he was pretty responsible with the use of them after we had them. But my younger son, he's always had video games around. He could play all the time. His older brother was like, hey, let's play video games. And he would play a little bit, but it was never something that was taboo to him. It was never something that was off limits. It was never something that even had a limit. And guess what? He didn't even want to play.
Right.
He didn't even care. He would play a little bit, but then he's like, this is boring. Let's go do something else. And I really felt like it was because we kept it from my older son, and drew this hard line, and you can't do this. And you can say that about junk food. You can say that about sugar. You can say that about certain behaviors or drinking or whatever. If it's just so off limits and so taboo, why is it the kids want to do that so bad? Like that's what they want to do though.
Yeah. Because it gets them, it like puts them into a different gear. And if you have a child who's got any version of oppositional behavior, that's exactly where they're heading.
Yeah.
To the exact extreme of what you're asking of them. And I think that's part of it is, but I also think that kids learn that, video games become kind of their pacifier in a way, and they don't have to deal with anything, and it becomes sort of their cocktail at the end of the night. And so that, some people can have a cocktail every night and not become alcoholics, but other people can't have a cocktail every night because they become alcoholics. So you have to really understand that it's a very precarious situation when your child is sort of trying to navigate all of this. But it boils down to self-regulation And it also boils down to connection, because a lot of parents will tell me their kids will be gaming and then they're so crabby and they're so difficult after they've been gaming all day. Lots of that has to do with they've had no other stimuli. They haven't probably been eating well all day. They've just been eating, snacks and garbage all day. And so, I think sitting down and really talking about that with them, not from the point of an authoritarian role, but really saying, notice how you feel after you're playing these games. Like you keep saying you have a headache, or, wow, it seems like you're really cranky. Like, do you think that has to do with it? And, trying to get them to have some connections between how they feel and what they're engaging in will really help them understand how they feel about everything moving forward, but just in gaming in general, when they're around certain people, you really want them to be able to kind of tune into how they feel about certain situations. And I'm seeing so many kids that just don't have a sense of their own intuition and what they need anymore.
Right. It seems like, going back to something that you said before, like when you take your kids camping or fishing for the weekend and they're going to kick and scream and be resistant to it at first. When you're talking about, look, I mean, you've been sitting of course you don't feel good. You've been sitting on the couch eating potato chips all day. When's the last time you've had a meal? When's the last time you had any water? You've been drinking the Monster energy drink or whatever all day long. Yes, of course you feel terrible. Well, they're not they may be listening and they may hear you, but they're not going to just go, you know what? You're right. You're right, Dad. I'm not going to drink Monster energy drink anymore. I'm not going to eat these potato chips. I'm going to have a paleo meal like you do. And I'm going, they're not going to do that. They're just not going to do that. It may be a couple of years later that they're like, I don't eat that junk food anymore. You're like, well, why? I don't know. I just figured it made me feel bad. Well, something that you said got through. So do you just have to continue to reinforce that and continue to try to lead by example and try to show them that, look, I feel great. I ate a great meal, and I don't know.
Absolutely. I think modeling it makes the most influence on our kids. And you may not see it in the moment, but I think it's important to also understand, how did those chips get into the house?
Yeah, there you go.
Did the monster get into the house? Why do we have ding dongs in the pantry? Like, why is that all there? Part of it is we also as parents have to understand what we're doing to co-create this situation as well. I do think that kids need to have some ability to self-regulate with food and things like that. But I also hear from so many parents that they're so tired of what their kids are eating all day, but yet they provided all of the snacks.
Right.
So I think it's really important to think about that.
It is super important. And it's also probably important, just like it's funny, I haven't thought about this in a long time, but just like the gaming situation with my oldest son, we kept a really clean kitchen. We didn't have any junk food in the house for a long time. And I just felt like, the kids they're going to get this stuff eventually, at school or somewhere else. Why do we need to introduce them to it? Like, why we just don't need to have it around. Well, every time that it's a funny joke with my friend who is the father of one of my son's friends, but every time my son would go over to their house, he would go straight into the pantry and he would just start hoarding all of their junk food, right? Because he never had a chance to get it. So there's got to be some kind of balance there. And it just seems like maybe my kids are really have that oppositional behavior or whatever deep within their DNA, which wouldn't surprise me any at all, because they come from a long line of those type of people. But when you just say, no, you can't have this, right? That's what they want. So when it came to other things like drinking and stuff like that, I didn't do that. I was careful with that. I was like, well, I see what happened with the junk food. So what if we just said, oh, drinking, no problem. Like whatever. Not like here's a case of beer, go have fun, but just didn't make a big deal about it, right?
Right.
And like it wasn't a big deal. And you know what? They didn't gravitate to that. I don't know. That's one of those things where you just kind of, I think it's probably very personal, kid to kid, what's going to work and what's not going to work. And,
but I think it all goes back to the connection that you have, that emotional connection that you have with your child, and you know who they are. If you know who they are at the core and they know who you are at the core, there's so much more to work with. If we don't understand where our kids are at from an emotional place, we're not going to be able to read that well.
Right. Right. Well, all of that, I mean, I love all of what you're saying, and a lot of it comes down to personal responsibility, I think.
Can I just say one more thing, though, Tom? Because I think this is a good tip that everyone's going to go, oh, this is how I used to get my son in the woods away from his video games. We would go camping. We had in-laws that had a cabin, and I'd say, well, we're going up to the cabin. Let's go get all the junk food you would like for the weekend. And that's how I would get him. He could pick out whatever he wanted, and it could go up to the cabin, but we didn't have a lot of junk in our house.
Yeah. So he's looking forward to that. And he does. That was what we did. And what I've suggested on this podcast lots of times when you're taking kids fishing is give them the opportunity to have something that they don't get at home, whether that's an ice cream bar or some type of candy or something that is something that they don't get at home. And you only get that on the boat. And, you know, I mean, it might be that one little thing that gets them excited about going.
S'mores. Kids always think about camping and s'mores, right?
Right. Yeah. When are you feeding your kids s'mores at home? Well, I don't know. They have like s'mores cereal now. People feed their kids s'mores for breakfast, but you're not supposed to, and it's not a good practice. But that is something that we would do. And I would be like, you know, first of all, you know, take a nice lunch, have some things that they don't normally get, and celebrate it. Like, this is a special day. Here you can have whatever this is today. Yeah, exactly. And that does work, because if you can just get them to be even excited enough about going to the cabin or to going to the boat or going wherever you're going, and maybe it is that one little treat that gets them excited about it, then, you know, oh, cool, there's cool stuff in the live well, and I can play in the live well. I can play with all the bait. You know, like we cast net these little pilchards. They're like 3 inches long, and the live well it's like an aquarium. And the kids can put their hands in there. They can't put their hands in a regular aquarium, and they love it. And some parents would say to me, like, man, I just want my kid to fish so bad, but all they want to do is play in the live well. I'm like, let them play in the live well. That's awesome.
Yeah, that's the appetizer to fishing.
It. Yeah. A couple of years from now, they're going to want to catch the bait to put in the live well. And then they're going to put it all together, and they're going to be like, oh, I love this. But I was always happy with my kids playing with the bait in the live well. Like, whatever, man, you're out here with me. And that's awesome. We're together. We're having fun. If your idea of having fun is playing in the live well, I'm all for it, man. Play in the live well. Kill all the bait. I don't care what you do.
Right.
Like just it's gonna, you know, that's what it's for. So anyway, that's kind of cool. Well, I know we're getting close here, but I want to talk about your work with professional athletes too, because you've worked with a lot of different teams and professional athletes. How did that start for you?
Well, I am a licensed substance abuse counselor. And so I had a lot of referrals over time of, for some reason in Arizona, there's a lot of athletes that retire out here. And
it's warm.
I think they were referred to me lots of times because they had addiction to painkillers initially, or they had traumatic brain injuries that they were trying to recover from. But what I found is a lot of these athletes, in a lot of ways, were extreme teenagers. They were very gifted. They were treated very like special kids their whole lives. They were, and they didn't have a lot of self-efficacy. They were told what to eat. They were told how to exercise. They were told when to sleep. They didn't even have an internal understanding of how all of that works. And then, you know, they have this very successful career that's big, and they're making all this money. You know, they go from being this poor athlete to making over $1 million a year, but they have all these people relying on them. So they do have a lot of complicated pressure around that. And they don't know how to handle all of those changes in such a short period of time. And then when they get injured and released from the team, they go through a very significant depression. Many of them really don't even know how to do life, period. A lot of my time was really spent teaching them the life skills that they never had when they were younger, because they never had to clean up the dishes because they were always at practice. They never had to do chores. They never had to be a part of the family in any way, shape, or form, because they were these very special athletes that were always being taken care of by somebody else. So the downside to that is they didn't know really how to live an everyday life, how to have a morning routine. A lot of my athletes, when they would get released, would gain a whole lot of weight that first year. They would lay on the couch and eat Oreos all day because they were never allowed to do that. So they had sort of this delayed adolescence that they were kind of living for a bit until they realized that wasn't very healthy for them. Right. And then they had to figure out how to, get up every morning and have a routine, and how to cook dinner, and how to change light bulbs. And
it's so bizarre. It really is so bizarre when you think about this person that you've been watching on television for years, and they just seem like such a superstar, but they don't even know how to change a light bulb. They don't even know, they've never even been to the grocery store by themselves. Right. Like, that is such a bizarre idea. Well, it's bizarre, Tom, and for them, it's also very embarrassing. Right. They have no idea what they're doing. Right. Mm-hmm. Is that where a lot of them get these hanger-on kind of people that end up bankrupting them because they've got 40 people hanging around? Yeah, because they've never, they've always had somebody to defer to tell them what to do. They've never had to think for themselves. So a lot of them surround themselves with people that tell them what to do. And when you have a lot of money and not a lot of common sense, you surround yourself with the wrong people. You know what this reminds me of? Did you see Trevor Lawrence come out? Do you know who Trevor Lawrence is? He's a quarterback. He's a really talented quarterback. And he came out on somewhere, and he said something to the effect that, football wasn't the most important thing to him, and that he had other things in his life. And the media just persecuted him for this, what he said. And I thought, man, what an opportunity that would have been to be the other way. Like, look at this great quarterback who obviously has discipline and work ethic and is very talented, and he's going to be in the pros and he's doing great, but yet he considers himself a son, a brother, a whatever, and he has other things in his life that he's interested in. I mean, that should have been celebrated, rather than what? Like, this guy doesn't think that football is everything. Right. And that was the result. And he even had to kind of come back and say, well, I don't mean to say that I'm not excited about the next steps in football. It's just that if it doesn't work out, I got lots of things that I like to do in my life. And again, even when he came back and said something, it wasn't a very good reception by the media, which I found really like a bad message today. Right. But I also think that also has to do with, his truthfulness and his narrative did not match what they wanted his image to be. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, or the media, the team is probably like, well, aren't we glad we got this guy? He's solid. Like, he's not going to self-destruct. He's got a family and other things that he's interested in his life. That probably means that he's going to be a pretty solid player, right? Or a solid individual or solid leader on the team. Where, I don't know, I just that rubbed me kind of the wrong way of it, today, that you have so many, like, what were you saying before the podcast? You were saying there was a statistic about how many professional athletes go broke. 90% of professional athletes go broke in their first 10 years. Wow. In their first 10 years when they've been released from the NFL now, or from sports, professional sports. But the NFL actually has started to really work with their athletes on fiscal responsibility and how to manage their money. They have programs that they put them through now, which I think is really, really good and helpful because a lot of times, that
the NFL also stands for, I don't know if you've heard this, not for long. So that athletes, that's sort of what they remember. Like, this could be over in a year. So I really have to make sure that I'm taking care of this money and I'm a good steward of this money.
Right. It's really not that hard either. When you're dealing with amounts of money that you're hearing about, even to put 20% of that away in something, you would never have to worry about anything if you invested it properly. But it's, I don't know, bad advice.
But we're talking about young men who don't even know how to make dinner. Right. And we're expecting them to be stewards of their fortune, and so it's an unreasonable expectation, and they don't have the skill set to manage it.
So have you been able to, in your career, to help athletes like that you see are headed down this road of destruction and lack of personal accountability? Have you been able to help some?
Well, it's interesting because lots of times I get them after they've fallen. Oh. That's where when they show up at my door, when their marriage is falling apart, or they're in rehab for the third time, or they've had so many surgeries and they're in so much pain and they're addicted to pain meds and they can't even carry their children up the steps. And so I've seen kind of the downside of professional sports and what it's done to some people. And it's a very difficult thing to be 25 years old and on full disability because of all your injuries from sports and have to live the rest of your life. That's a lot. It's a lot to have to deal with and wrestle with. And it creates a lot of problems within the marriage because all of a sudden, my husband's not this superstar. We're not going to parties every weekend. We don't, we're not in the club anymore. And we have to, really be careful about our money. There's a lot of different things that happen within after an athlete is released, and how they acclimate to living everyday life is really important. It's really important to have a sounding board that's healthy and well and stable, because if you don't, that's when people end up really self-destructing.
Yeah. I mean, you've seen it so many times. It's not even important to bring up any names. I mean, I'm sure everybody listening can think of 10 people that come to mind immediately that this has happened to. And it almost happens, the same kind of thing happens to a lottery winner too, they've never made that kind of money. So that they're like these milestones that you achieve as you're making money and achieving wealth over time. And you're used to this lifestyle, and then you're used to this lifestyle, and you're used to this lifestyle, and then you're used to having a big paycheck and taking and just knowing, no, that's, somebody looks at the check and they're like, oh, wow. Like, what are you going to do? Buy a Tesla? No, I only get a small percentage of that. The rest of it goes over here and here and here and here. And then you're living below your means. I mean, even the act of living below your means is something that a lot of people are unfamiliar with. And that's what seems to happen to lottery winners is they're not used to any of these benchmarks, and all of a sudden they go from here to here, and then they find themselves almost exactly back where they were before, which is a strange thing. It's almost like that's like a psychological thing that they go back to making almost exactly the same amount of money that they made before, because that's where they were comfortable, and all this money comes in, and it's almost like they're just getting rid of it as fast as possible, But anyway, I don't know. I don't want to end this on such a downer of watching professional athletes and heroes that you have self-destruct, but not every one of them does that, and many do get really good advice.
I get the ones that are really floundering. Right. But what I will say is, if they have a purpose following sports, that's what Trevor Lawrence was talking about. I'm not just an athlete. I'm a father. I'm a son. I'm a teacher, however that person defines themselves. That's a lot of what I do, is help them define their purpose so that they can define the next chapter of their life and have the pen in their hand. Up until that moment, somebody else has been writing the book. And in this next moment, they get to be in charge of what happens, and helping them understand that's a good thing and not a bad thing is sometimes tricky.
Wow. That'll be our next podcast that we can do together is how to define your purpose, because you hear that so much right now. You got to know your why. You got to know your purpose. You got to, and even people like, of this audience ask me, like, how do you know that? And it's like, well, I mean, some time with introspection and sometimes you just know, but then you're like, I don't know if that's the best advice. Like, I don't know because even if you do know your purpose and your why and you have a good purpose, sometimes that's fluid and it changes and you determine, okay, well, I have this purpose, and yes, that is definitely something I want to do that in my life, but I also see that this is really important over here. And now you have two things which can kind of compete with one another, and that's a strange place to be. But I'd like to talk with you about that at another time. So if we were to close this out with some advice to parents, what do you say is the way that you can kind of connect with your kids, but also use it as a checkup for where your relationship is? Like, how do you best kind of check in on your kids and realize where your relationship is? Maybe it's great. Maybe it's awesome. And for a lot of the people listening to this podcast, it probably is, because they go out on the boat on the weekends and they're spending a lot of time together. But, teenagers are hard, no matter how perfect they are. But what would you leave us with?
I think that's a great question, Tom, because I think the most important things when my kids have told me, the most important moments for them have been when I have come into their world. So I've come into their room and laid on their floor next to their dirty socks and said, how are you? Like, what's going on? Tell me what's going on for you today. And I want to be a part of what's going on in their world. I come in without an agenda, a prescribed agenda, but really just understanding who they are in that moment, what they need from me, how they feel about being in the world on that particular day. And I do that with my kids. I did it on a daily basis. I would check in with them at certain points in time, not only when I was angry with them or they didn't do a chore or they were in trouble, but really in a very neutral, very calm and neutral time. I would just want to be in their world and make an effort to see them in a very organic way.
Interesting. Yeah. And it does, I guess their world sometimes is their bedroom. Maybe it's sitting down in the gaming room, or wherever they're the most
Have you ever
most
played
comfortable.
video games? Have you ever tried to play video games?
Yeah, I'm terrible at it.
Yeah. But it's fun. And they're so excited to try and teach you and tell you what they're doing and what they're not doing. And I hate video games.
Yes.
I cannot stand video games. But that was a way that I would connect with my son. I'd be like, hey, or he'd go to the bathroom and I'd like control his game for a little while. And his friends would be like, what are you doing? What are you doing? And I'd say, oh, Chris, I think I screwed it up. And it would be funny. My mom was on, it would be for him. It was part of me being in his world.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting if you can get a kid to try to teach you something that tends to go a long way. But okay, well, man, I learned a lot, and it made me have even more questions. So I hope that we can do another podcast in the future.
That would be great. I would love it.
I wish you all the very best with your book, The Bravo Effect. Where can people get that?
You can find it on Amazon.com.
Amazon.com, The Bravo Effect.
Barnes & Noble, and you can get it on Kindle.
Okay. And do you have social media, or can people follow you there?
I do. My website is thebravoeffect.com.
Okay. All right. Well, that's awesome. Dr. Lisa Bravo with The Bravo Effect, and a lot of good advice for us parents and probably prospective parents, because it is a precarious world to navigate right now, if you ask me. But thank you very much for being on the show and all your good advice. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you for having me, Tom.
You're very welcome. All right. See you.